Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our program today, sponsored by the International Association for Peace and Economic Development, which is one of the primary associations of the Universal Peace Federation, an organization that was founded by Dr. Sun Myung Moon and his wife, Hak Jahan Moon. My name is Roger Weatherall, and I'm going to be the moderator today for the program. And one of the goals of this association is to look at ways that changes in the world affect the economy and vice versa. And the topic for today is around birth rates. So birth rates are probably one of the most important economic issues in the world today. And they are going to have a huge impact on what happens in the future of the world. So I'm very happy that we have two speakers today who can really talk about this issue. So if you look at birth rates, so most countries in the developing world are seeing reducing, in the developed world are seeing reducing birth rates, whereas in the developing world, in places like Africa, birth rates are still increasing.
I would correct that just a smidgen. I mean, they're decreasing all over the world,
Okay,
but
thank you very much,
they are
Daniel.
still
Yes,
higher in some countries, but they're decreasing all over the world.
thank you. So we are going to be able to dig into these issues and see how things are going to affect the economic balance in the world today. And we have Daniel Hess and Robin Hansen who are going to be speaking to us about this. We're going to get their input, and then at the end of the program, we'll have a chance to ask questions and to engage in some dialogue together around these issues and come up with some thoughts. Okay. So Daniel, first up, I wanted to introduce you since you kind of jumped in already. Daniel is promoting the growth of birth rates by being a father of 6 children himself. And he's a graduate of Cornell University's engineering, and he's worked in intellectual property for many years, but he became focused on demography after the realization that many of the most innovative countries, such as Japan and China, etc., have extremely low and falling birth rates that threaten the future of technological innovation in the world. So he writes on X, on the account @morebirths. So if you are an X follower, you can certainly follow him on X, formerly Twitter. And I'd like to introduce Daniel now. He's going to talk about this and give us a presentation, and then we'll have Robin Hansen come on and give us some additional thoughts about that as well. So would you like to share your screen and get started?
Sure thing. All right, so this are birth rates the most important economic issue in the world today? I would say absolutely yes. We're gonna take a look at what's going on, why this is an issue of such importance, and ways to think about it, why it's so serious, and what are some solutions to the birth rate crisis, which is very far from being solved at this point. So here we can see, this is a map of the world. We can see the portions in red have fallen below replacement. The portions in green are still above replacement. Our replacement fertility is considered 2.1 births per woman. It varies just a little bit based on infant mortality and things like this. But you can see all of North America, virtually all of South America, all of Europe, almost all of Asia, and most of the world in general is below replacement fertility now. And the portions in red, which are below replacement and in almost all cases falling rapidly, represent 90% of global gross domestic product. So how bad are the numbers? most low, well, there's a misconception. People think, and economists and forecasters, thought for a long time that birth rates would drop to about replacement level and stay there. But actually, what we're seeing is birth rates drop very far below replacement. This table is by the account birth gauge on X, and it's a very wonderful source of demographic data and fertility data. And we can see that for so many countries, birth rates are not just below replacement, but far, far below replacement. Countries uh, only around half of replacement include Japan, China, Korea, Canada. Canada is falling almost to half of replacement now. Spain, Poland, Chile. So these are places, East Asia has things kind of the worst. They have fertility rates. In South Korea's case, only about 1/3 of the replacement level, which is which points to catastrophic population collapse in the future, and likely also economic collapse if things remain on their current trajectory. So what's the big deal? Things don't seem to look that bad, right? The economies are functioning, everything's going great. GDP is growing every year. Well, what we're looking at, if you look at this chart on the left, that's total population. That looks kind of okay. I mean, in South Korea, even population is just dipping a little bit, and it's near its all-time high, so that looks fine, right? Actually, what we should be looking at, what we need to be looking at are population pyramids. And if you look, this is the population pyramid of South Korea in 2021, and I regret to say it's getting even worse, if that's possible. But we can see that for the younger cohorts, under 20 and especially under 10, there's very, very few people. So there's just not going to be very many workers in Korea that, to replace the massive generation that's retiring. And if you look at the shape of this curve, you can see that between about the age of 20 and 65 is a large group. So Korea's economy has been booming, but the group that's coming after is very, very small and getting smaller and smaller each year. So that's what we need to be looking at, and that points to dramatic collapse in Korea economically. And this is just a representation of many, many countries that are like this. Korea is a little bit more extreme of an example, but you see most European countries have a pyramid kind of like this. Italy's population pyramid is kind of like this. China, Japan, many countries are in this state of demographic decline bordering on collapse. There's this misconception that began in 1968, and it is still, more than 50 years later. This is 56 years after this book was published. The population bomb, most of you have heard of it. Paul Ehrlich predicted in this book, by 1980, everybody's going to be starving. It's too late to save ourselves because of overpopulation. He was completely and widely wrong. Population was already dramatically, birth rates were already dramatically on the decline by the time he wrote this book, and have since, fallen very dramatically. But the ideas that he spread that of fears of overpopulation are still with us today. And if you ask most people on the street, I think most, or at least a very large share, will think that the overpopulation concept is the thing that we have to fear, even though that is what was wrong at the time that it was published, and is utterly wrong in a world of fertility rates far below replacement. So another thing, people will tell you the planet is overcrowded. That's not true. So here we have these are population density maps of California and Korea respectively. So we can see, I chose these two because they're, well, these are regarded as very populous places. But even in these populous places, you can see most of California is sparsely populated. Most of Korea is sparsely populated. People are, crowding with high density in a few places in Korea. I think this is Seoul over here. This is Busan, I think, in the south on the, but even most of Korea has a lot of space. The idea that that we're running out of space is just a completely untrue misconception. Here's Elon Musk, the most popular and famous futurist. You probably have heard of some of his warnings. Population collapse is an existential problem for humanity, not overpopulation. Far too many people are under the illusion that the Earth is overpopulated, even though birth rate trends are so obviously headed to population collapse. So here's, Brian Kaplan gives a great explanation. This is from his book, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. But he talks about, and I don't think I need to go through this entire quote, but it'll be part of the presentation for those who want to have a look. But what he talks about is that people working together build an incredible network of collaboration and shared innovation, so that each individual invention can be shared 7 billion with 7 billion other people. And this collaboration, this working together is the reason that large populations don't bring resource scarcity, but actually resource abundance. And here I've got another title that's incredibly important that explains that. This is The Ultimate Resource by Julian Simon. He's the one that rebutted Paul Ehrlich so famously. And so the reality is that it is cooperation that really brings prosperity, many innovators coming together. And that is the reason why Paul Ehrlich was so wrong. As populations grew since 1968, there were more people able to work together and collaborate and invent and bring us the relative prosperity all around the world that we've seen today and in recent years. But the flip side is also to be very thoughtful about. This is a chart on the left by Spears at the University of Austin. This was recently published in the New York Times. What population trends are looking like. It looks like we're very close to the peak of global population and heading toward collapse. And given what we know about collaboration and cooperation, bringing prosperity, riding the backside of that curve will bring the opposite. You will lose the network effects. You'll lose the benefits of shared cooperation, and so that's going to be a pretty hairy ride down if we don't correct things. And another thing to keep in mind, actually, the peak of births, the largest number of births is already, was already back in something like 2005 or so. So actually, the absolute number of births has been sharply declining already for some time, but population keeps growing because of aging. So even, there's a huge and growing share of people over the age of 60 or over the age of 70 or over the age of 80. So the aging part of the population keeps growing. So that is the reason that population keeps growing by population momentum. And here is some insights by economics professor and futurist Robin Hanson, who we're very grateful to have here with us today. I'll quote a little bit from a podcast he gave in September. The usual projections are that most of the world is already at below replacement fertility in the parts that are above are heavily, vastly declining. Relatively soon, world population will peak and then start declining. It is quite plausible, at least in my recent analysis, that when population starts declining, soon afterwards, the world economy will start declining, and soon after that, innovation will come to a halt because you will lose economies of scale and specialization and the like. So, and actually, we have this isn't raw speculation. We're seeing what's happening in Japan. This is from The Economist, I think about a year ago. Japan, which everybody thought in the late 1980s and early 90s was going to take over, where everybody was saying we're all going to speak Japanese because they were riding success after success. But what we have seen since then is a dramatic decline in innovation in so many of the major categories in Japan. Now, Japan is kind of a bellwether that we can talk about because Japan has begun on the aging trajectory earlier than most other countries. So it's a well-known fact that Japan has been performing poorly for the last 30 years or so. That first lost decade, second lost decade, third lost decade, and everybody's wondering, why it's some weird Japanese mystery that, don't think about it too hard. Japan's just weird in that way, right? That's been the narrative. But actually, a paper called "The Wealth of Working Nations," there's a list of authors here, explained what was going on with Japan. And these are charts from that paper. Japanese GDP per working age person has been doing wonderfully since 1990. In other words, Japan is right up there with the United States, tracking the United States wonderfully in GDP per working age person. So what's actually been happening is that in Japan, the population itself has been declining, and that has. This is looking at the population age 15 to 64. So this is your, standard working age range, and we can see instantly what's been going on with Japan there. They've been in the doldrums in spite of increasing productivity and so forth, because their population is just simply declining. It's not that complicated of a story. I posted about this paper, and that post got more than 3 million views with dramatic attention in Japan. Actually, it blew up on Japanese Twitter, so that was kind of remarkable. But it's a very important story, and the thing is that you don't have to project very far in the future to see that many countries are going to have the exact same population curve that Japan is having. So if we project to 2050, remember 2050 is as far away from now as now is from the year 2000. So that's not very long at all. And in 2050 we can see that kind of population decline in, countries like Korea, Germany, Italy, many others. Meanwhile, Japan is going to be quite a lot further down the track. So things are going to be grim throughout the many developed countries. So let's talk about innovation a little bit. This is invention is what created the Industrial Revolution. This is from Our World in Data, which is a wonderful site that everybody should be having a look at. Here are annual patents granted in Great Britain. So we can see that the patents just soared. They just absolutely took off in England, Scotland, and Ireland during the time of the Industrial Revolution. So we can see actually that the Industrial Revolution was heavily driven by invention as measured by patent grants. And so this is a chart that I made and published on X. We can see on the bottom we have a log scale of patents per million residents, and on the vertical axis, we have total fertility rate, births per woman, and we can see that the most inventive countries almost all have very low fertility. We see the lone exception of Israel being the one highly innovative country that also has a decent birth rate. But here we can see the line of replacement, and virtually every single highly innovative country is well below replacement. And South Korea, by this measure, is the most innovative country in the world and happens to also be the country with the lowest birth rate in the world. What this at 0.7 births per woman, actually the 2024 figures are just coming out, and if the current trends continue for the rest of the year, South Korea is going to be at 0.68 births per woman. So this means a group of 100 South Koreans will have just 10 grandchildren and just 3 great-grandchildren. So this is total dramatic demographic collapse in just a very, very relatively short period of time. And we can see the same trend with the scientific output. This is scientific publications per million people. And we can see once again that virtually all countries that are involved in scientific output have far below replacement fertility. So what we're seeing here is that the economic hit from demographic decline is going to be much worse than raw population numbers suggest, because it's those very countries that the world depends on most for both invention and scientific breakthroughs that are going to be most crippled by demographic decline. So this is going to hurt the whole world. And once again, some very, very low birth rate countries here. Here's Korea, here's Canada, Singapore. Countries that have very high scientific output these days, almost all have very, very low fertility. We can talk about immigration. Immigration is talked about, and immigration, it has helped America, quite a bit. There, of the, some of the great, the operators of many of the top companies in the United States, for example, are immigrants. But it's not a global solution. One country's gain is another country's loss, and rich countries are taking the greatest talent of many of the poorer countries. This is certainly the case, for example, in India, where if you look at the graduates of the Indian Institute of Technology, the very top graduates, almost all of them end up in America. I saw some figures at one point. So that's good for America, but a terrible loss for India, and not a global solution. Here we can see the demographic profile of Ukraine just since the year 2000. So we can see that Ukraine has, the flip side of immigration for countries in Europe and the Anglosphere is often dramatic loss of populations in other countries. And here we can see Ukraine is a great example of this. Nobody is moving to Ukraine. I don't think anybody. But here we can see just a dramatic plunging. They've lost almost a third of their population just since 2000. And there's this optimistic hope on this curve that they're going to keep growing that they're going to start growing again, presumably when people return, but there's no guarantee of that. But it's the immigration is not a reliable fix. So many countries like Korea will face inevitably major economic declines as their workforce collapses. And there's no way to escape this at this point, because there's this huge demographic hole that you see under age 20 and especially under age 10. And those people have already been born. That generation, that cohort is already alive, and there is nothing you can do at this point to plug that gap. If you're a country like Korea or China, for that matter, that is not a major immigrant receiving nation. Both of those countries actually often have significant outmigration to Western countries. So the real hope, the real answer, the only answer is ultimately that people need to have more children. That's the only economic solution that works on a global scale for everyone. So I want to talk a little bit about solutions. That's what I uh, post about on my More Births X account. So the first thing, so what we see here, there is one country that I mentioned which has above replacement fertility that in the developed world. Among all developed countries, every single one but one has below replacement fertility. That exception is Israel. And what does it have? Israel is urban, it's expensive, it's as I understand, quite feminist, and it's very technological. But it has one thing, which is an intensely pro-natalist culture. People in Israel deeply believe in having children, and that seems to be the biggest and most powerful factor. And I've written a lot about that. But there are, France in Europe seems to have a more pronatal culture. In Hungary, they're building a pronatal culture that seems to be making a difference. But that is the biggest lever. Uh, it's kind of nebulous. What exactly does that mean? Well, certainly in Israel, people understand very deeply that birth rates and having children is an existential issue for the country. There may be hope then that other countries can. That's my hope, is that can be there can be awareness all over the world about this. Okay, marriage culture. There's another one. One constant that remains true is that people tend to they're far more likely to have children if they are married. And this hasn't changed in the last more than 40 years. People who are married, you know, have vastly more children in the United States and around the world than people who are not married, even though many will say that marriage is an outdated institution in terms of fertility and birth rates. That's not true at all. And actually, if you can see very recently, the gap has even been growing because among unmarried people, the births per thousand women has actually been dropping dramatically since 2008, whereas it's been holding steady for married people in the United States. But what's really happened is that far more men and women have gone from the married category to the unmarried categories. The rate of marriage has gone down, and that explains in large part why fertility rates have plunged so much in America and around the world, is a major drop in marriage rates. So that's focusing on marriage is one solution. Another solution is in the realm of education. In most of the world, people actually want more children than they have, but they simply run out of time. This wonderful chart is by Lyman Stone at the Institute for Family Studies, and you can see that almost all these below replacement fertility countries, in these countries, the fertility ideals, in other words, how many children women say they want to have, is far higher than the number that they have. And most people simply are running out, many people are simply running out of time to have children. And a solution to this is education. Young people need to be educated very early in high school and sex ed class, what the fertility window is. So much of sex ed class is focused exclusively on, making sure you avoid pregnancy. But in fact, it's a much greater problem in the world today that people do not have the children that they hope to have, that they say they want to have. So it's not simply a problem of nobody wants to have children anymore. People do want to have children, but there's so many other things happening, and people aren't focusing on it at early enough ages. People need to be getting partnered and starting on their families, and in this part, not at the age of 36, 37, and and up, because fertility is much lower, or past this point it's over. So there's a major scope for education. Another point is religious belief and practice. There's no escaping this in the data. Religious attending people tend to have more children on average. This is a chart that I made. If you look at U.S. states by weekly religious attendance, there's a very strong correlation between weekly religious attendance and the total fertility rate at the state level. And this is also true at the individual level. And there was recent research as well that I saw recently that highly educated among highly educated people, there is, I should say, religious practice and attendance seems to have the strongest impact on highly educated people. So, so a lot of very smart people who are, if they are also religious, will it tends to the impact there is very strong. So that suggests that it can be very pro-social. Here's another point. Environmental optimism and success needs to be what we need to talk about. There's this, a big cause. There is a very strong antenatal movement in the world and in the United States. You can see this on all kinds of things. You can see this in the comment sections of the New York Times. You can see this like all over Reddit discussion boards, but there's a very strong antenatal movement, and it's kind of tied to this idea of environmental doomism. But here we can see a very, this is on the left and the right, these are the same place. This is the Fresh Kills landfill. This was a very famous landfill in New York, the largest landfill in the world when I think it closed around the year 2000 or so, but when it closed, it was the largest landfill in the world. And here we see on the right, on the right is Fresh Kills Park. Now this is the same spot, and the garbage is all still there, but it's a very beautiful park full of wildlife. And this is an example of an environmental success story. We are actually succeeding on many fronts. Energy sustainability is happening at a breakneck pace. The price of large-scale batteries has plummeted just in the year 2024. Just this year, we're seeing incredibly low prices, which is a huge positive sign for sustainable energy all over the world. And the price drops coming dramatically in electric cars and so forth. So but that story isn't being told, and it would be a terrible tragedy if people stopped having children for environmental reasons just at the moment that all the environmental problems are being solved. Okay, here's another point, is healing the cultural divides between men and women. So this is a chart that appeared in the Financial Times by John Byrne Murdoch. This became widely publicized, but there is a growing political and ideological gap between young men and young women. Young men have been veering strongly to the right, and young women have been veering strongly to the left politically. And some other statistics which I've posted on my X account, in the United States, interracial marriages are more common now in the United States than interpolitical marriages. Imagine that. That's this huge ideological divide, in South Korea, especially where this ideological divide is largest, this is really impacting, relationships by causing actual acrimony between men and women. So this is a major avenue for work, for reconciliation, for harmony. I don't know how exactly somebody wants to achieve that, but that is a major cause actually of birth rate declines as well. Density, so the housing. So here we see two very different types of housing. Here on the left, you have metropolitan Atlanta, and on the right you have Seoul. And the fertility rate in the picture on the left is almost three times the fertility rate of the picture on the right. So Seoul's fertility is something like 0.5 or so, 0.55 births per woman. In Atlanta, it is at least 3 times as much. Does anybody want to venture a guess why? We can see why. Housing has been shown statistically to have a dramatic effect on fertility, and the remarkable thing is actually, those very beautiful palatial homes for middle class people in Atlanta are actually dramatically less expensive than those high-rise apartments in the urban core of Seoul. And so there needs to be a lot of thought as to building and how we build going forward, because the built infrastructure is going to be around for many generations. So it matters tremendously how you build. Here's a few other solutions that I just want to mention. Roles for older people with grown children. So intergenerational help financially can be a major positive. There is a very large wealth gap in the United States and around the world right now between sort of the generation that's about to retire or freshly retired and young people. And house affordability is very difficult for young people, and there's a lot of scope for intergenerational help financially, to help young people become homeowners, help with childcare. There is, and also cultural support for young people. There are roles for governments as well, financial support programs of all kinds. I'm not going to go into, what those are, but there's all kinds of things being proposed all over the world. But I want to mention that those government programs actually can be seen kind of as part of pronatal culture. When the government is providing support for birth rates and fertility, the government is actually sending a cultural message that we value children very much, we value families very much. So in conclusion, we either have to reverse birth rate collapse or face economic and cultural collapse. The math is inescapable. No matter how good things look economically today, if population collapses, economic collapse is inescapable. So this is reversing demographic decline is the most important economic policy, and the most important thing culturally as well that you can have. Thank you very much. Here you can see I'm trying to do my part. There's me with my wife and our 6 kids. Currently, this picture was taken a little bit earlier, but currently ages 16 down to 2. So I'm busy when I'm not thinking about the fertility issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. That was really interesting. And we had a couple of questions in the chat, and I just wanted to put one of them to you first from Jim Edgerly. In the beginning, you were talking about economic collapse, right? And that's a very strong term to use.
Yes, it is a strong term.
Sorry,
not sorry.
Do you have any examples historically of nations that have undergone economic collapse? I mean, you pointed out Japan as kind of a static, not growing, but can you think of any that have collapsed in the past?
Well, yeah. The major evidence, if you look carefully at the history of for example Rome, actually, is that the strongest evidence I think we have is that the biggest reason Rome collapsed is because of low birth rates, actually. And there's a lot of evidence that Roman emperors kept making these decrees and these laws to try to make people have more children, and they did not succeed. And so it looks like that's what happened to Rome. We're in kind of new territory a little bit here, because this hasn't, and Japan, you say, Japan has been sort of stagnant. They haven't collapsed. Well, there's a couple things going on there. Japan is still very early on. Their workforce is, down by what, maybe 10, 15%. So they're just at the beginning stages, and we see what awful uh, problems that they're having already with just a 15% decline in their working age population. I want to, by the way, really draw attention to Robert, Professor Hansen here. We're so incredibly lucky to have him as a guest, and I'd love to, hear him
Yeah.
share some.
So let me introduce Robin. So Robin is an associate professor of economics at George Mason University, and he's also a research assistant at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University.
Which no longer exists.
Okay. So he has a PhD in social science from Caltech, a master's in physics and philosophy from the University of Chicago, and he worked for 9 years in artificial intelligence as a research programmer. So I would like to have Robin come on the screen here and present your thoughts and your ideas on what has been presented already from Daniel, and also anything else you'd like to add. And then we'll have some discussion together. So put your questions in the chat, everybody.
I could go on for hours, but I won't. Try to keep this short so we can have a discussion. First of all, I want to make clear, the parts of what Daniel said that I agree with, because I want everybody to understand he isn't just a lone person making crazy, accusations out here. He's right, and I think there's roughly a consensus that, in fact, fertility has been declining consistently for centuries now. It isn't just a thing in the last few decades. I don't know if Dan made that clear. In Europe, it first started declining about 250 years ago. In France, it's been declining consistently worldwide since then. So we have these pretty steady trends. The trends are on track to continue. The number of births peaked in 2016. I think he said 2004 or something, but yes, basically we are no longer making as many babies as at the peak, and that should just keep going down. And that you can just predict that'll mean the population will peak and go down sometime in 30 years or so. And I mean, there are some immediate things, which is that when you have more old people relative to young people in a declining population, then it's harder to support the old people through taxing the young people. And so many people are very well aware of that problem of taking care of old people in a society. And then older societies are less dynamic, less innovative, and we're definitely seeing that. But these are just the short-term effects. Unfortunately, the big problems are going to take a long time to play out. And so, like boiling the frog, people may in some sense just not care. But more fundamentally, the innovation of the entire world will slow down. And as population falls, the economy will fall, and basically the innovation rate will fall, because innovation is roughly economic activity as a percentage of all the activity you've seen so far up until that moment. And in a declining population, that becomes much smaller than it's been in a growing population. So innovation will grind to a halt. But a lot of our liberality of our world was caused by innovation. That is, a few centuries ago, the world, had a lot of kings and class and repression. And the thing that forced a lot of the world to be more open and liberal was the fact that the richest countries were liberal, and that was enabling their innovation, and the others didn't want to get left behind. And so they realized they needed to be more open and liberal if they were going to keep up technologically and economically with the leaders who were relatively liberal and open. But if innovation grinds to a halt, it'll no longer be such a pressure, and plausibly nations will drift back to a more natural state of repression and control, because that's what people at the top tend to like. So that's the kind of future we're looking at. And even worse, in some sense, our civilization will slowly decline population-wise and economically, but then plausibly we will just, instead of going extinct, be replaced by the very fast-growing populations that we already see around us that are now small, like the Amish or Mennonites or Haredim, double roughly every 20 years. And in a couple centuries, they can come to dominate the world. So that's roughly what's at stake. Not just a few centuries of declining consumption and innovation, but basically our current dominant world civilization being shunted aside and replaced. That's pretty dramatic. Now, Daniel talked about a number of solutions and a number of issues, and I just want to highlight the key distinction. That is, if you're standing back looking at your whole nation or whole civilization even, and looking at its health, you will see, it's having a problem, and you could see that you might fix it by various things you could do to encourage it to be different. But the problem is fundamentally rooted in individual personal behavior. And the question is how to influence individual behavior when individuals are choosing to have fewer kids. And if you just tell them maybe it's good for the world that there's more kids, that doesn't necessarily move them so much. So the key question is, what can we do to change individual behavior? So like Dan points out, when you ask people how many kids they plan to have or want to have, it's higher than how many they do. Obviously, if that's actually the reason why they're having fewer kids, we should just tell everybody. But I think we've been kind of telling everybody for a while, and they kind of know it by now, but still they're having fewer kids. So it seems to me there's more fundamental structural problems going on here. It's not just that people are somewhat unaware of the fact they're having fewer kids. There are just a lot of deep cultural changes that have encouraged fewer kids. And then you want to try to somehow reverse those. And I just want to make it clear how hard that is. So
it's going to be very hard, yes.
Right. So I think we want to try, but I want to, it's not just like there's this one parameter of civilization. Oh, how friendly we are to our kids, and we just want to turn that knob. That knob is already being set by a bunch of other knobs. And I want you to make you more aware of the other knobs here that are setting that one knob. So over the last, half century or longer, we've had a number of strong cultural trends that have caused lower fertility, plausibly. Certainly urbanity, as he says, density, lowered religion, have also caused that to some degree, environmental concerns, but more fundamentally just longer career paths, more education, early career paths, switch from what they call cornerstone to capstone marriage norms in terms of what you should have already when you get married. There's, norms about how much attention parents should be paying to kids, and those have gone way up, and that's making it hard to have kids. Norms about grandparental involvement. So obviously, one of the things he mentioned is that if grandparents could help more, then that would make it easier for their kids to have kids. And I think, I know a lot of grandparents who would like to encourage their kids to have kids, but there does seem to be a cultural obstacle that grandparents are afraid of seeming too pushy on their kids. And somehow we need to get over that. Obviously, people centuries ago didn't have a problem with that. Grandparents were okay with being pushy, but now we're not so okay as grandparents with being pushy. And that means, we don't want to pressure them to say, live near us instead of moving away, so that we could help, or we're afraid if we give financial payments for grandkids, that'll be too pressuring. I mean, there's a standard thing about, kids coming home at the holidays, and the parents want to ask about kid plans, but dare not, because they dare offend. And many kids are, in fact, offended by their parents asking them, so what's your kid plans exactly? And so somehow we need to get past that cultural obstacle to grandparent help, because that's in the way. And so we have so many of these strong cultural trends that have been causing lower fertility. Challenges how to reverse all those trends. I think there are some sort of mechanical policies that say governments could just pay more people to have kids, but the obstacle there is really that people have to want to change these cultural trends enough to adopt policies that would then push for changes. And I think that's the key obstacle. If you see, say, op-eds or discussions about people talking about, natalism and fertility, you see a lot of people really just ready to, diss them, basically attributing them to being white supremacists and all sorts of things on the basis of they must have nefarious motives for trying to promote fertility, because they're trying to integrate this into culture wars. And that's an obstacle here, because many of these trends that have been causing lower fertility are treasured trends, trends that many people really like, even relatively liberal progressive trends. And many people fear, perhaps correctly, that reversing the fertility decline will cause the reversal of, say, gender equality or you know,
Sure.
encouraging people to work and et cetera, things like that. And they fear the cultural reversal more than they fear the economic and cultural civilization collapse, honestly.
So Robin, that's an interesting point that you bring up about the working on the individual and the social level, right? To reverse these trends. And I mean, that's a trend I see around me, you know. Our generation was like, you have a family, even though you don't have any money, right? But
Right.
today it's like you've got to have, you know, $500,000 before you start having kids. That's what people think, right? So how do we kind of change those cultural norms? Do you have any thoughts around that? Or Daniel, you're a good person to talk about this with 6 kids yourself, you know, in that generation. Whatever you
Yeah,
think.
maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic that things can be malleable in culture. I see a great question from Jim Eberly. Israel is also facing many of these same cultural trends, and that's my belief or hope is that, you know, with enough, you know, Israel they have faced, obviously, you know, they have an existential need to have enough children, or they're going to be in big trouble, you know, based on their neighbors and also based on their history. You know, my hope is, my optimistic belief is that if people can get desperate and urgent and panicky enough, if people can look into the abyss enough and see, you know, what's happening with their countries and their societies, that they can, you know, somehow find ways to make it happen, just by having intensely pronatal belief. My personal sense is that if you have a very strong pronatal belief, it can, you know, overcome a lot of negatives, and that's my hope.
If we just had a lot more war in the world and a lot more countries felt scared and threatened like Israel,
I don't think
that
that's a
would
good
probably
solution.
work.
I
But
don't think that's a good, okay.
No, yeah, we don't. Yeah, these are open questions, but you know, certainly we have to try our best
Yeah,
in many different angles, and we don't know what's going to what may work in one country may be different from what may work in another country. It's been suggested that for East Asian countries, you have to, you know, uh, tie like admission to selective universities to like the number of children people have, or things like this.
right.
There's all sorts of things that what works in one country might be very different from what works in another.
sure. Okay,
But the main limitation is having the motivation to try these things.
right.
There's a
I
whole
have
bunch of things one could try, but if you don't try them, it's not going to work.
I have a bigger question though for you around this. Okay, what do you think is the optimal number of people in the world? Because, you know, there's still a perception that we have too many, and it's actually a good thing that we kind of reduce a little bit. And then, you know, maybe, or even just keep the same, right? Right. So what do you think is optimal?
I'd say population isn't the sort of thing that just can sit at some level naturally. It naturally either declines or increases. It just doesn't hang out in the middle.
Okay.
So between those two, I'd rather have an increase than a decline. If you say, well, you could get too big, couldn't you? And I might say, yes, but if you were getting too big, the way you'd notice is poverty, disease, famine, things like that. That's how the world would tell you you're getting too big. So as long as you're still getting richer, I'd say you're not too big yet. So obviously we should make sure that when there's externalities or costs in the world that are being transmitted to the people causing them, so that people will get the signals about the harms they're causing if they are. But overall, as an economist, I'd say we're not too big yet, and we're probably not even close to too big. So let's keep growing.
What do you think, Daniel?
Yeah, I hear, and I would kind of second what Robin is saying, and in particular the numbers that we're seeing are just horrifying, honestly. You know, as you know, they're not stopping anywhere near replacement. We're at, you know, just imagine, you know, where things are headed in Korea, for example. Imagine the population shrinking, each generation being 2/3 smaller than the previous generation, and that's
Okay.
and country after country is doing this. So
let's describe that a little. Let's envision that. So in 2050, what is South Korea going to look like?
That's a it's a it's a it's a very good question. I think they're going to have dramatic economic decline that may even look like collapse no matter what, because there is simply no way that they can have a new, that they can have a workforce in the future like they have today, just because those people the younger cohorts have already been born.
Okay.
Um,
So,
so
Robin, why don't you describe?
Well, I
You're
mean,
the visionary
so the
around
nice
this.
thing about the demographic graph that Daniel was showing you is that you can predict 30 years in the future just by moving the stuff up 30 years on the graph. That's the
Right.
whole point of it, right? The whole population pyramid is locked in from the people who are born now. Like how many people there will be 30 years from now, 30 years old, is exactly the number of people who are born this year. How many people will be 35 years old is the number of people who are 5 years old now. That's why you can use these demographic graphs to predict the future pretty well in terms of everybody who has already been born. Then the
We're
question
going to
is,
have an inverted pyramid, right? We're going to have
right,
a huge population of elderly people in their 80s and 90s because they're living so much longer. And you're going to have like a tiny population of people who are in their 20s and 30s, right? Maybe 20% of the population, and no kids, right?
right. So you're trying to tax all these younger people to pay for the older people's retirement.
Right.
And you're hoping for innovation and growth on the basis of these young people who there's hardly any of them. And then if you've got military conflicts, you hardly have any soldiers to manage them with.
and these heavily burdened young people are also supposed to have a lot of children too. So my goodness, it'll be
Right.
quite a difficult situation for them. Good
And
luck.
they're all going to want to move to other countries where they don't have to pay the high taxes to support the
right.
old
So, or you're going to want to import people, but you're going to be competing to import from all the other countries that want to import people, and it won't be so easy to import.
Right. Interesting. Interesting conversation here. So there's a couple of other people who have recommended some other books in articles in the comments, and people are totally welcome to look into those. Another point is, okay, you talked about Japan and the way that Japan is perhaps, in this stagnant or declining level, but the overall kind of, what do you call it? The earnings potential of each person was still going up, right? It was still increasing per person. So that was so they still had the same quality of living. Now, if we can maintain the same quality of living despite a declining population, I mean, what's so bad about that? I'm just playing devil's advocate here.
They're growing in their abilities because they're part of a world that's growing. So it's mostly the entire world that grows together because our world economy grows together. But when the world economy peaks and starts to fall, all of these things will also fall. Now, they probably won't be getting that much poorer, but they'll no longer be getting richer, and variety will go down. So a lot of our world is full not just of things you can buy, but of an enormous variety of things you can buy. And people really enjoy all that variety. And as the world economy shrinks, that variety will shrink proportionally. There'll just be fewer TV shows and fewer songs and fewer couches and fewer cars and fewer everything. So if you think a couple generations into this decline, you're imagining a world that's not richer anymore, but not that much poorer, but it just has vastly less variety available to it.
And there's another point that Professor Hansen has made, which not very few people are making this point. I don't know who else is, but the fact that you lose the innovation frontier. Maybe you can, talk about what happens there. Right? You've made the point that you can't you can no longer innovate at the cutting edge anymore.
Right. Well, I mean, say a few generations into this decline, the world will just have the same technology generation after generation, and they won't really have much new. And the variety they have will drastically decrease, even given the same technology. And that's just a very different world that we're not very familiar with. That's how the world was 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, et cetera. The world, technology changed slowly. And that was a world where you had kings and classes, and people weren't very eager to promote innovation because it hardly ever happened. and then they could lock down patterns of social behavior because people like to lock down patterns of behavior and keep everybody in their place.
Okay.
We've allowed a lot more dynamism and variety and, you know, competition in the last few centuries because people realize that's what you have to do if you want to keep up with these rich, fast innovating nations.
Mm.
And if that stops, then the pressure to keep up with them that way will go away, and people will go back to being traditional societies where not much changes. And so you have a hereditary elite that stays in control and makes sure everybody stays in their place.
So generally speaking, though, as societies become more advanced or developed, the birth rates have declined, right? We're seeing now in the world that countries like in Africa do still have high birth rates, even though they are declining, but their populations are increasing as a whole, whereas we're seeing in Western or developed nations that those populations are declining. So this, what I'm seeing is there's going to be a big change in the balance of population and money and power, economic power, as well as political power throughout the world in the next 20 to 30 years because of this.
But perhaps to some extent, I do want to mention, you know, the whole entire continent of Africa, you know, including South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, the entire continent of Africa is only 3% of global GDP right now, you know, and, you know, that's obviously going to increase, but, you know, to imagine that one continent is going to carry the world, I think is not remotely realistic, and we shouldn't expect that, and you know, that's unfair to them, and you know, unfair to us, that you know, that they, you know, so you know,
So
that go on.
just to be clear, you know, world population may peak around 2060 or something, but the world economy will peak sooner than that, and world innovation will peak even sooner, you see, because as Dan says, it's the richest places at the moment that are producing the most innovation, and they have lower fertility. So this problem is coming sooner than you might think if you just look for peak, when population will peak and start to decline. Well, the economy will peak a bit sooner than that.
Right. This hits at the core of global economies, because you know, the economies that are really doing gangbusters and leading the world economically are the very same countries that are facing this demographic collapse.
Mm.
So yeah, it's gonna it's gonna be worse than you would think just by looking at, you know, total population numbers, and as Robin says, you know, it's going to be happening sooner.
Okay, so we're at time here, just after 3. So I wanted to just give you each a time to a few moments to kind of wrap up, to give some closing statements. And can you give it a positive spin? Because you've given us a lot of bad news.
Well, you know, if you want to, if we're living at a time when it's, if you focus on this, and you know, those who can, you know, find a way to, you know, put the brakes on this and even start to turn it around will be world historical figures. So, you know, I don't know, you know, it's going to take some incredible people who with you know, incredible, you know, I like to think optimistically that these trends are not set in stone, and the, you know, people with the ability to see and understand can turn things around. You know, I think a good a kind of a positive example is France, actually. You know, we mentioned Israel already, so Israel is one example, but France is another one. Throughout the 1800s, France had by far the lowest fertility rate in the entire world. They didn't grow essentially at all for about 100 years up to World War II. So, you know, so they went from being like almost like the China of Europe to having far fewer people than Germany, and we know how that wound up for them in World War. But they really had a deep national realization, and you know, every president since World War II has been, you know, incredibly pro-natalist in their words and in their policies, and France, ever since has had the highest fertility rate in Europe. So, obviously still below replacement, but there is a lot of room to influence things and make the future better. And that's that's the burden of all of us, to try to creatively use our powers and influence to figure that out.
And Robin?
If nations felt more rivalrous with each other and competitive, maybe even more eager to gain advantage, they might then try to promote fertility, because it is one of the biggest ways in which nations have changed their relative position in the last century, is by relative fertility. I guess the problem is they don't feel so rivalrous or ambitious, at least enough to overturn their local culture. So I've come to the opinion that fertility is fundamentally a culture problem, and it's being caused by an underlying lack of health with our system of cultural evolution. And that's a bigger problem even than fertility, which is a symptom of the problem. If we solve our fertility problems, that would maybe delay and give us longer to deal with the underlying problem. But there is this deeper underlying problem that our cultures just have a lot less variety than they used to, a lot weaker selection pressures, and they drift or just change autonomously a lot faster than they used to. And that altogether suggests they're just going off the rails, and fertility follows one of many ways they would be predicted to go off the rails. So that is not your requested good news. That's saying that this pretty bad news might be a sign of an even deeper underlying bigger bad news.
Okay. Thank you very much. Anyway, thank you both for your enthusiasm and your diligence in pursuing this issue. And I think it is really important that we deal with it. And I think the Universal Peace Federation is uniquely positioned to highlight these issues in the world, because we reach out not just to economists or politicians, but also to religious people and artists and people in the social services and all different aspects of life. And I think we need to take a multidisciplinary approach to dealing with these things. So thank you both, and we will conclude our program here for this week.